We would like to begin by acknowledging that Blue Metropolis, a partner of Concordia University, is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganyangehaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Jojake, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Welcome one and all to this final conversation in our Spanish Digital Dialogues series brought to you by Blue Metropolis. We're on this occasion of our passing the guest of honor in Frankfurt torch to Spain. We're discussing our books, our writing, our literary production, our challenges and opportunities, but in the process also we're bringing to light and sharing a little bit about who we are, what we do, and where we're going, you know. So on that note, you know, this is the translation panel, is the last one that we're recording in the series. I invite you to check out the other four. So the names that would come immediately to mind when one is thinking of doing a translation panel between Canada and Spain is Katia and Lawrence, that you'll meet here today. No doubt, for many reasons. They go much further than translation. They both wear many hats, you know. I'll prefer for them to introduce themselves or to tell you who they are, and then obviously I invite you to read their bios. They're posted below or also in our website. But Katia, for example, one of the things that it's an actual line from her bio, and it's so correct, you know, is also frequently solicited as a member of literary and grand juries, consultative bodies, and as a book reviewer, you know. So that's part of what is going to come to light here on this occasion of Canada and Frankfurt, you know, being guests of honor Canada and Spain being guests of honor at the Frankfurt Book Fair, to talk a little bit about the people that do the work, you know, that are behind the scenes of a book beyond translation, you know, but also focusing on translation and focusing also on their own personal, you know, who are the people that are the mediators of culture and language and that are, you know, making one book turning it into another. You know, what does that mean, and what happens in the process, and what's the difference, and what can we learn from the Canadian and Spanish experience, but also general experience anyway. Well, so we'll start with Katia. Here we're starting here at home in Jojake. So Katia, tell us again, you know, thank you for, by the way, answering my call to be a part of this panel and offer your expertise.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, for having us both here today. I appreciate being included and the conversation that's ongoing, of course. So yeah, I'm Katia Grubisic. I've been based in Montreal, Jojage I lived here for about 15 years now, and I've published poetry, some short fiction, and a fair bit of literary translation, especially in the past few years. I've been shortlisted a couple of times for the Governor General's Award. And I've published translations by writers, by Nicole Brossard, by Martine Delvaux. I'm working on a second book by Marie-Claire Blais, the late Marie-Claire Blais, due out in a year and a half. So I've got several projects on the go. My Spanish is limited. I speak más o menos que más, but I speak enough to have used Spanish as a tool for doing my scales, for you know, honing my chops. A long time ago, when I had more time, I would sit down in the morning and do like one Neruda sonnet a morning, not for any audience, but just to actually get it out. So I'm looking forward to seeing where this conversation's going.
Oh, so delighted to have you, Katia. We already have so many questions, you know, but let's go to Lawrence. Exactly, and Lawrence taking notes as well. But most of all, so the idea is a conversation happen between you two. You know, I want to be the proverbial fly on the wall here. So Lawrence, go ahead, please, and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay, well, first of all, hola from Madrid, Spain, which is where I'm zooming in from right now. And it's a pleasure to be here, to be part of the festival, and also to meet Katia in person. I define myself most as a reader, and I knew Katia mostly through her work, not as a translator, but her work as a poet herself. And so it's a pleasure now to be in this dialogue. We haven't ever been in the same space yet. It's our first actual dialogue that's not strictly through print, and so it's a pleasure, and I look forward to our conversation. I'm a bilingual Spanish-English author, anthologist, and literary translator. I also run a small poetry press. As an author and anthologist, I've published around 120 books for all ages. My father likes to joke that I write books for children and books you don't want your children to find. I've published quite a number of titles in Canada, just as a sample, and also to remember my friend and colleague Richard Levante, who he and I did these 4 anthologies for Arsenal Pulp Press. Together, he passed away last month and is dearly missed. This was a book of ours, First Person Queer, that won the Lambda Literary Award. As an author, I'm also, one of my books was translated into English by Elisa Amada and published by Groundwood, a children's title. And two of my books were recently published in Canada by Orca. These are two little board books, which were originally written in Spanish. I translate quite a lot for Canadian publishers as well. I've translated around 130 books in total. Mostly I've done over 50 picture books and over 45 collections of poetry. So those are my strengths, although I do also translate fiction, essays, other things. So.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. Again, right from, and I'm sure Katia as well, so many questions, to ask out of every single thing you've said. But let's take a little bit. Before we talk a little bit about the industry, I want to talk a little bit about, because this is one of my personal interests as a scholar, which is professions, or the study of professions, or how professions actually happen. And I wanted both of you to share, to go back a little bit to the beginning. How did you become a translator, or what's your first of all, tell us what you studied. And I know that Katia is an expert in philosophy and phenomenology. I don't know why I have that in my mind,
Not remotely.
Not even, okay, maybe, I don't know why I have that, I don't know, for some reason I picture you editing an essay that I have on Martin Heidegger. I don't know why, as a Jew. But anyway, I digress. Lawrence, I know you went to Yale, right? I mean, you studied literature. But anyway, that's why you tell me what you studied and also like how you, first encountered, like how you thought of translation as a profession, as a job, because it's not your typical profession that you think of, like a lawyer or a doctor, when you're a little girl in front of the mirror, I'm going to be a translator. It's how does that happen? Like how do you enter this the industry, and also the craft, and also the profession? Tell us about how translation came into your lives, and also focusing a little bit also, if you can, on the Canadian and Spanish presence in that. To give us a little bit of a feel of your experiences in both countries. Starting with Katia.
Sure. I mean, I'm curious. I have also questions for Lawrence. I'm really curious as to how. For example, board books and children's books are a whole separate category of translation, often in terms of recognition as well. So I'm sure we could talk for several hours just about every question that we're raising as we mention it. I've in some ways I've been translating all my life by accident, right? I grew up in a multilingual household with immigrant parents who are multilingual themselves. But as I got older and as English became my dominant language, because it wasn't my first, I began to be the kind of the Englisher for some of my father's work. So he would give me the last draft to fix, and I showed kind of literary proclivities young, and so excuse me, and so at one point, he would give me actually things to translate for inclusion in anthologies from Croatian, and so translation. I mean, I think that I don't think no kid or very few kids look at themselves. You're right, and say I want to be a translator, but I think it's a proclivity, or often an accident of behavior and context and skill that arises, as opposed to a deliberate process you set out on. At some point you realize that you have access to these multiple languages that not everybody does. And so in my case, I began to do technical translation as a way to make some money before I realized that literary translation was not a literary act, but also potentially a career choice. So my first gig translation was when I was in my undergrad and just needed some money, and I saw an ad posted in the French department that the New Brunswick Hog Marketing Board, of all things, was looking for a translator for their monthly newsletter. And so I think I did this 8-page newsletter for $100 a month or whatever it was, and they gave me a ham at Christmas every year, which was hilarious because I was vegetarian. But that was, you don't realize, I think, at some point that you have that code switching that not everybody does, and that you can think in one language and write in the other, or vice versa, and that's actually a marketable skill. As far as literary translation goes, I think that's a different beast, because as much as no kid looks at themselves in the mirror and thinks, I'm going to be a literary translator or any kind of translator as a career, you look at yourself in the mirror even less and say, I'm going to make money at this. I don't think, it's not, it's better paid than authors are paid often, especially in Canada. And I'd be curious to hear what the circumstances are in Spain. But there's not I think I fell into it by a happy accident. And as a way to keep my creative, to remain creative while being a young parent, because it's not obvious to find the empty blank time to write while doing that, while parenting. So that's sort of my background. I'll let Lawrence maybe speak to his, and then we can go back and forth a little bit.
Lawrence?
Yeah, lots of shared experiences there, and especially juggling, finding time for one's own writing while also translating. And I think it's the eternal dilemma especially when translators are at a certain point when you have a steady amount of work, it's always easier to translate a book that you know a publisher wants, as opposed to writing something that then you have to struggle to find publishers for, and you don't know if you will at any point. And so that's always a time management skill, I guess, with all the busyness of life as well. So you mentioned, Ingrid, that I did attend Yale. I started publishing as a writer before that. So my first contracts, my parents actually had to sign the contracts because I was underage. And so I was a voracious reader. I read through everything I could get my hands on. I read through the entire sci-fi section of the local library.
You still are.
And I still am. When I ran out of books, I started creating my own stories. And so, I started in the genre of science fiction and started selling before. When I applied to Yale, I applied as a marine biologist. My dream was not to be a writer. My dream was to be a marine biologist. And I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau. That was my dream for years and years and years. I'm deathly allergic to fish. And it was just so dangerous for me to be touching fish all day. And then, you go like this without thinking about it. And that's a membrane. And that's enough to provoke an attack for me. So those dreams went out the window, and I wound up graduating with a degree in English. I fell into translation. I mean, I also grew up in a household that was multilingual to some degrees. My mother studied in Spain during I grew up in New York. I was born in Manhattan. My mother studied here in Madrid during the late Franco period. So a mother tongue for me was that I could speak in Spanish to my mother, and my father wouldn't understand. So that was one sort of a secret language we shared. But because both of my parents were working, there was a series of usually Central American young women who my parents helped to get their papers in the States. And then, so they would be with us, get their papers, and they would go off and get a job that they could, now that they had employment. And usually a cousin would come over, and they would be the people who took care of my sister and me while my parents were still at work. So for me, Spanish was a very domestic language. So I grew up, toggling back and forth like many of us who grew up in multilingual households. I fell into translation. I identify, I don't know, Katia, if you identify as a writer who also translates, even though my translations have now overtaken my own production. And at the same time, I started translating in terms of books. I mean, I started as a writer in terms of what I was publishing when I was still in high school. But the first book I actually published a year before my first book of my own came out was a translated graphic novel that happened. I was at a literary conference talking to a publisher that I knew socially, a comics publisher, and literally the person who was translating the graphic novel had a heart attack and died. And he needed someone who could take over, do the translation within 2 weeks. And I said, sure. So it was, I started in translation as a sort of very Grub Street sort of thing. I mean, especially since I came into my writing life in the sort of pulp magazines and the science fiction genre, a lot of erotica pornography. I was very much writing is something we do for money. It's a way of, so translation, most of my translation happened later where, because I was writing in multiple languages and publishing in both English and Spanish, a lot of Spanish publishers started asking me if I could translate stuff into English for them to use to sell rights with or things like that. And especially since I've been here in Spain, lots of translators who work in the opposite direction. I do now translate in both directions, something that happened after I started being translated from Spanish into English by other people. So that gave me a lot more confidence in what I call my stepmother tongue. And now I do translate quite a lot in both directions. But for most of the translators here will do English into Spanish, but they don't know native Spanish into English translators. So I got a lot of referrals from colleagues. And it was interesting, Katia mentioned Neruda. Part of my falling in love with Spain was through Lorca. And so I first came to Spain on my own in search of duende. So I had been studying, when I was at university, I was swapping English lessons for flamenco lessons. And then I came to Spain, stayed in the house of the family of the woman who I'd been giving classes to, and was studying to dance flamenco when I was 19 in Granada. And years later, I came back, supposedly for 6 months, and I've been here for 23, 24 years now. So, it's most of my adult life has been here in Spain. So,
Well, Lawrence, this is fascinating. Katia, if there's anything that you'd like to respond, I have a ton of questions, but if there's anything in particular, okay, so let's focus then a little bit on, so that we make sure, there's so much to talk about. Let's now talk a little bit about the industry, the importance, the significance of having this boost, of having this platform beyond the soft power also, which is one element also to discuss. It's the networking opportunities, the grants, the translations, and particularly in the case of Canada, we had this double year because of the pandemic where we were supposed to be guest of honor in 2020. And the result from that, one of the things that I've been learning is, and again, I'm a journalist, mostly not, the book industry is not a literary programmer, but there's so much about rights and translation that I'm still learning, or even 20 years of being around this, there were 200, the number jumped from 200 titles to 350 in the 2 years, which again was a significant, unprecedented, to use a cliche pandemic word, but it was, for Canada. And so Katia, if you could address that a little bit, and Lawrence too, because you translated also in Canadian titles, what that means financially, the opportunities, because again, one of the areas that I think Katia touched on is how you make a living out of this and how well you're paid or not. So let's talk about the industry and the remuneration, and also if you can touch on a little bit about associations and organization of labor, meaning do you belong to a union? Is the work regulated? How does it work in Spain and Canada, in Spain and Canada, and how tell us about the you as a member of the industry and what you could share with us. So starting with Katia.
So I think it's true that Canada had the double boost, which was a silver lining to an initially fairly catastrophic cloud. But I think, in fact, if anything, the boost is really to Germany. I think that what's really advantageous about a book fair like this, and it's been around for decades, and so they've had a chance to have the momentum as well. But what's advantageous is that they increase the books available in German, which is not a minor language by any stretch of the imagination, but they go out and they've created this huge infrastructure that allows people, i.e., writers and especially publishers, to want to sell rights in German or German language rights, and to German language publishers. Which is to the good, I think, of the German readership. There's obviously benefits to the featured or honored guest country as well. But to my mind, the ideal scenario would be for every country to have their giant book fair, every fall. We could have one every 2 weeks all around the world, and we would never get any work done. Basically, we just spend our time jumping from one to the other. But then for everyone to have that access to other languages, and for every country to have that infrastructure, because as much as some of the things that were a bit challenging for individual writers, which I'll address in a second. But really what's wonderful about that is, as a reader, like, how much would I love to have, exponentially more books translated out of German, or exponentially more books translated out of any language as a reader to have, and also as a writer for, looking for writers that I'm translating or looking for new associations. So the networking is huge. And I think it's huge for individuals who go there as well, for the small presses that get to kind of amalgamate, or often have shared booths, or go in, with some kind of subsidies and have this exposure. Because to use the Croatian example, for example, I translate very little out of Croatian. In part, I haven't been there in years, and I am about X number of years behind the market. You really have to be in a place and be in contact with what's going on, and go to the readings, and especially for minor genres like poetry, for example, or you can speak to sci-fi as well. You miss things completely if you wait for the mainstream to kind of filter things out, right? You read maybe 1/18 of what's actually published, and it's often the most accessible and most marketable work, but it's not, as a translator and as a reader, necessarily the kind of stuff that's going to set you on fire, let's say, right? Anyway, I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit, Lawrence, or...
Well, I have a question for you, which is, have you ever been to the Frankfurt Book Fair?
I have never been to the Frankfurt Book Fair.
Okay.
Yeah, I was, and there was the delegation in 2020 was supposed to be fairly large. I was not part of that initial. I think there were 80 people that they had lined up, and then they of course had to whittle it down for the second hybrid, but adjusted year, that I think they only had a handful of people go, and then they sort of sprang Margaret Atwood there at the last minute as well. And so I'm speaking from experience based on actually, I have, as a rent-paying gig, I translated the final report for the Frankfurt Book Fair for the Canadian delegation. And so I have all the numbers kind of really fresh in my mind. But also I'm comparing it to any other, even the Salon du Livre in Montreal as a more local thing, or any event that's that has that kind of networking and sales pitch. Like the Canada Council used to organize here every year a translation fair, sales fair, right? So there was like 2 days of everybody kind of hang out and go like, what did you do this year? Yeah. Well, you know, and it was very much this, it was kind of a love fest for the books that you really had, that you had fallen in love with that year or for those couple of years. And that's the most earnest kind of best part of it, I think, for me, of any kind of sales, you know, right sales fair.
I think, you know, I mean, I've been attending the Frankfurt Book Fair since 1997, so 20-something years without fail, I've been at the fair. I love it. It's very different than, I think, like the Salon du Livre that you mentioned, because I think that is primarily oriented towards readers as opposed to rights people, even though there is some of the rights selling that goes on. I think also that our situation is fairly different, that if I'm not mistaken, Katia, you're mostly translating Canadian writers between French and English for Canadian publishers primarily. And that's something that's very different. I mean, you
that's one of my questions, by the way, if any of you would like to address or touch or keep in mind at one point, is a translation within our own minority languages and both Canada as multilingual languages with minority languages. If at any point you want to touch on that, that's also something that we have in common. But Lawrence, please continue.
No, I mean, but that's something that's very different about the sale of rights for those titles than, like, for instance, or my role as a translator from Spanish. And, you know, now that we have all this extra funding from Spain being the guest of honor, I've been able to pitch books to publishers outside of Spain in the Anglophone world, very differently, having this extra push from the Frankfurt thing, boost that we get. I think also that, you know, historically, I mean, just to go back a little bit about, you know, the industry remuneration, stuff like that, which we didn't quite touch on, but, you know, Canada has some things that they treat their translators very well. You know, the tariffs are very high. It's necessary that translators get paid for anything that gets Canada Council funding, which is, that's something that doesn't exist from from the languages I'm working with, Spanish and English, and especially not for poetry. But, you know, one big difference, I think, also is that the LPI, the Ley de Propiedad Intelectual, so intellectual property law here in Spain, requires that translators get a royalty. And that's something that is very different, I think, from Canada, where Canadian translators are paid a lot more than we are here in Spain. But usually it's a flat fee, even for novels, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And so that's someplace where work needs to be done in Canada to get, you know, recognition that we as translators are the new voice, the new creation. You know, that's something that Spain does. I think both countries also are very good at that, where the PLR, the public lending rights, both countries do have translators. We get public lending rights when people take books out from the library that we've translated. So that's definitely something. My experience, you know, as someone who's been going to Frankfurt for years and years and years, I love it. I love the, you know, it's sort of the Jewish mother in me loves the matchmaking, you know, and I sort of want to make, you know, even if they're not my books, but, you know, it's sort of like, you know, friend, you need to meet so-and-so and do a project together because she has the perfect book that I know you're looking for, you know. And so a lot of, you know, one of the reasons that I translate a lot, or I sort of, as a translator, work as sort of an unpaid scout in many ways, that I find books that I fall in love with that I want to, you know, bring to an audience that can't read them in that language. And so I do a lot of this sort of matchmaking, you know, building it on the context that I've built up over the years of attending the Frankfurt Book Fair in particular, but lots of other fairs as well. It's definitely been much easier for me to pitch Spanish projects with the funding that, so there's a special line of funding, which is different, I think, than the case Canada. Canada has always had good support of translations of Canadian writers. So, you know, even before they were guest of honor, if I or someone else wanted to translate in Spain a Canadian writer from English, from French, from any of the indigenous languages, the Canada Council will fund 50% of the translation costs. And that's an ongoing program. Canada's program has also been much more egalitarian and easy to use. You know, Spain has the Ministry of Culture, a sort of very difficult system in place that existed already for the translation of Spanish books to any other language. It's very expensive to apply because everything needs to be legally translated into Spanish, even if you don't get it. You know, so you cannot apply in English. That's something that is a big hindrance. And one of the big changes with the Spain's Guest of Honor at Frankfurt program is you could apply in English now. And so that made it possible for many other publishers to actually apply to get support in order for them to publish Spanish titles. And so, that's made it easier for me and lots of other translators or publishers who found stuff directly to buy rights to Spanish titles, which are coming out over these years. It's something that I hope will continue. I think that, as I've seen over the years, many countries come, they have their moment in the sun as the guest country, and many national programs see that as the ending, whereas really that's the opening of the door. And it's very important for publishers, writers, translators, all the participants in the chain to continue going to Frankfurt, and also for the support to happen after Frankfurt as well. So, like Spain is going to be the guest country this year. Many editors, translators will only discover writers and books this year at the fair, and so there are probably people who came last year who discovered Canadian content that they didn't know about. Luckily, Canada has this ongoing program, so there is still support available. The Spanish support so far hasn't, they have support up until the fair. Hopefully they'll be able to continue it after the fair, because I think a lot of people won't discover these titles until that moment. So much though depends on personal contact. And this is sort of like the matchmaking thing that I was saying, and it's one of the things I talk about with newer translators, literary translators. Very often translators fall in love with a book and they become translators because they want to bring one particular book. And having a career as a translator, though, you need to match the authors you have or the projects that you might want to translate to the tastes of the editors you want to work with. And these are only things you get to know over time. So you pitch a book and the editor says, I like this of it, but not that. And so then, or they mention something and then later on you're like, I found the perfect book for you. And it's knowing that, which is only something that develops over time, and so it's sort of, as a career translator, you need to be more open to just the one project you fell in love with, which is great. And sometimes these things take a long time. I'm publishing this fall a book that when Mexico was the guest country in 2014 at the London Book Fair, I translated a sample, had been trying for all this time to find a publisher to do this book. And it took almost a decade before finally we achieved it, that a publisher bought the rights and commissioned me to finish the translation after the sample I did and stuff. So, these are things that take time. And one thing which I haven't mentioned yet, going to the fairs is so important because of the serendipity factor. So, let's say just the three of us. If I'm at the fair and I'm talking to Ingrid and Ingrid suddenly, sees Katia walk by, she could introduce us in person for the first time. And then another fair later on, we would run into each other. And it may be that we don't do a project together, but Katia's with someone else and I do a project with that person, and that only happens if you're at the fair. And so it's vitally important to attend them, and one of the things that I think that the guest of honor programs do is it opens doors for publishers, especially, but writers, translators as well, to be exposed to that. And very often it teaches them how to take part in the scene. So very often, especially for a lot of smaller publishers or publishers from certain countries, until they're a guest of honor, they may not have ever been there. They may come from languages that are not as commonly spoken, and that they may need to learn how to prepare sample translations in other languages so that people can more easily access stuff. I can also mention just I think I said that I'm a poetry publisher, and one of the things I did was we started an imprint of women poets in translation into English. This we started in 2014, when it was revealed that everything published in the US from all languages, fiction, poetry, nonfiction, only 26% were by women writers. And I know that as a Spanish to English translator, all of the support programs from the Spanish language, except for Argentina, are really misogynistic. Argentina is the only one that's egalitarian. They don't care if you're Cortázar or if you're a 16-year-old girl in Ushuaia, literally, the last town in Patagonia, with your first poetry collection. If you're an Argentine writer, they will fund a project. So, but the rest of the Spanish-speaking world's programs tend to be much more misogynistic. But for instance, in the case of our Slovenian poet, her collection, her first collection was published in Argentina, and I was able to read the Spanish and decide to publish her in English because it was a language, by being translated into a larger language, it then created access in a way that just having the Slovenian, I and many other editors were prevented. Just a funny anecdote, a publisher here in Spain read the English and decided to publish in Spanish her next collection because he was able to read the English. So it was a funny, from Spanish into English into Spanish again, always with direct translators from, it was a direct translator from Slovenian into Spanish who did the work. But if he wasn't able to read it in English, or I wasn't able to read it in Spanish, it wouldn't have happened. So
one of the advantages of book fairs like this, and of any event that has that kind of wide openness that allows you to sort of hopscotch from one language to another, even though the source language and the translation happens directly, I think is a boon for countries like Canada, in part because we have the advantage, yes, of having 2 colonial languages and a range of Indigenous languages. And so the Canada Council programs are set up to support that, in part to facilitate the dialogue between the 2 colonial languages for the most part. And so that support is really is ready-made, though it's not always, c'est pas évident then to, like, the sales don't necessarily come with, but that's thankfully, as a writer and as a translator, that's not necessarily my concern. But the I guess not the downside, but what happens then is that it can become somewhat insular to the good, because we could spend our entire careers translating just the production that's created here in Canada. But then if you don't have to pitch in a way that forces you to look at multiple markets, and if you don't have to pitch in a way that forces you to have this kind of exercise that you're referring to, that fluidity that allows you to see not just kind of the love of the project. I mean, I'm still carrying around that first book, trying to pitch it, that I've had for years, and she's not a Canadian author, and so what that international exposure gives you is that it internationalizes your skills as well, right? You have a sense of the multiple readerships, of the almost endless fields of interest that you could have and that you could sell to, far beyond the borders of what our country necessarily funds because of this model that we have, right? The flip side, of course, that allows people to international readers then to discover even writers writing in Indigenous languages, for example, or small presses, this kind of stuff. But I think it's fantastic, for example, and Blumet does this really well. I mean, you mentioned the Slovenian writer. I chaired a Slovenian panel at Blumet a couple of years before the pandemic, and it brings together writers in ways that mimic, that kind of echo what you're saying, right? This kind of like the mother-in-law who's like, you have to meet this person. Oh, do you know this person? And the exchanges happen instantaneously, and of course, ultimately you already knew the person, or you knew their friend, or there's your cousin or whatever. There's always this kind of like pre-existing affinity and complicity that I think is brought to bear immediately as soon as you're in that connection, as soon as you make that connection with someone, which is really, which is the flip side of the work we're doing by ourselves in our heads and in our offices, and in our, it's what reminds you that you're also a social animal, and not just a cerebral person taking it out commas and putting in commas.
Yeah, I don't know how much relationship you have with other translators from your source language. That is, I happen to, for mentioning Slovenia, a friend of mine who's a Spanish to Slovenian translator, she and I will regularly just meet up and be like, well, what are you working on? And because we've sometimes translated some of the same authors, I into English and she into Slovenian. The same with a colleague in Japan who's actually translated 2 of my books into Japanese. But we've translated out of Spanish some of the same titles, and so we often share what we're working on in order to there are projects that might be of interest translator to translator. So that's also something that
when it happens simultaneously, it's ideal. I mean, the German translation of Marie-Claire Blaise, Songs for Angel, came out just before, so I was like maybe 8 months behind in my process. And so, the concerns had already been solved, essentially. But I remember, I think Jenny Croft was saying something about this when she was working on Olga Tokarczuk at one point, that all of her translators had this Facebook group, and then so they'd get together and be like, what happens here on page 6? What are you guys doing with this catastrophe over here? I can't solve this. And often, the solutions, of course, are not the same because the problem's not the same, but inherently I think that as much as compensation happens within one text, sometimes perhaps you can compensate across the board as well. You see the book more broadly in those cases, right?
Yeah.
I love that idea.
I've been involved in a number of European poetry festivals which were multilingual. where we used often English as the bridge language and then translated one another. But it's also been fascinating to see the times English fails. You know, I mean, working both French and Spanish are inflected languages. So if it just says teacher, I need to know, is it a male teacher or a female teacher? You know, and that's stuff that very often in the bridge language is missing. Although I found that a lot of times authors who I've translated from Spanish into English wind up having translations into other languages because, you know, so people have translated into Burmese, into Arabic, you know, using my English translations. Those poets, you know, so there is a lot of the politics of language and power and which languages are, you know, powerful languages. I know this as a writer, where when I write in English versus when I write in Spanish, I have access to editors all around the world very differently. So if I don't do a self-translation or if someone doesn't translate me into English, very often I am much more limited in terms of who can consider buying in rights to the texts. So
let me ask you.
Sorry, Katia, I just want to ask the one question, you know, just because we have 10 minutes and there is one question that I want to ask. Is that okay? Like, I just want to make sure that we touch on this because, and again, you can go back to discussing this very issue of dominant languages, you know, but it's just one thing that I find interesting about Canada and Spain, both presenting themselves in Frankfurt as plural countries. You know, Canada, like the branding was singular plurality, you know, this idea of multiplicity. And now Spain is like the hashtag spilling creativity, and the words are imaginative, digital, inclusive, sustainable, creative, you know. And one of the talks in the series was a dialogue between, you know, a Quebecois and obviously a Spaniard, you know, and both countries are very Catholic, you know, and very, so, and I had to ask, so what does inclusivity mean when you come from a culture that are countries are Quebec, like both regions are very, you know, have a very specific discourse that isn't necessarily inclusive, you know, especially, I mean, when it comes to homosexuality and it's, or, you know, or non-hetero-binary, etc., you know. But the point is, how do you feel? My question to you is both personal and also in terms of painting the scene. Are we in a plural moment? Have we arrived? Is this really a reflection? Where are we at in terms of addressing the people that don't really think in inclusivity or that don't really respect, you know, pronouns and language? I mean, is that really the face of Canada and Spain, or is it just in our industry? Like, what does that mean to you? And also in a larger picture, I'd like you to take that question in whatever direction you'd like, you know, and starting with Katia.
I mean, I think that Spain's response this year and the way that they were branding, which is great, and I think which is relevant, was maybe a direct response to their previous presence at the fair, which was somewhat criticized, right, for the way that Catalan writers were treated, and some of the sort of where those lines were drawn. The Canadian, I mean, Canada is good at checking the right boxes, and some of the people who are around at the table, both in the steering committee and in the actual staff of the Frankfurt committee, and in the representation of the writers, there were fantastic writers that were from that wrote in both languages, fantastic Indigenous writers. You know, the representativity felt organic in a way that wasn't just tokenistic. You know, that said, I think sometimes the separation is between the sort of general society, the Costco shopping populace, and perhaps the people who, you know, the kind of the book fair populace. And I know that sounds really elitist, but I do think that there is, I mean, Quebec is inclusive and really open in some ways, within the boundaries of a kind of capital Q Quebecism. And current politics is very different from that even, right? You can listen to like the trash radio that's going on and see how the politics are switching to a very populist, much more right-wing sense, like style of leadership, to appeal to that broader voting public, I guess, or, you know, it's not even citizenry anymore. But that's a different concern, I think, than who's reading and who's writing and who is being written about. There's a range, and one of the things that I think the Canadian delegation was that there was a range of, you know, popular, for lack of a better term, literature that was there. As well as stuff that was maybe a bit more niche or a bit more recherché, and there was room for both, you know, the events. And I think that actually, ironically, I think that the digital infrastructure that had to be created made room for a much wider range of voices, because you no longer had to be someone who could, you know, whose publisher could afford to fly them over or whatever, right? So you had, the possibilities were actually broader because we had to juggle. But as much as as much as I have criticisms of Quebecois society for, I think, the reasons you're alluding to, I think that the books allow us to sidestep those for the good and for the bad, right? I think that there's also great books that take those exclusionary tendencies to task and do so very well. But they're also, I mean, if you can't be inclusive in your literature, if there's not room for every voice, and if you can't make room for every voice, both as someone who has the podium, like that's part of your job, I think, is or part of your duty, let's say. But there's a number of publishers almost for everyone, I think. And we're never, and especially now when you can, when publishing has tools that we didn't have maybe 50 years ago for dissemination and for bringing people together. I actually think it's a really fruitful moment probably for people to find their voice, and for those of us who have a voice to be able to widen the scope even further.
Thank you, Katia. Thank you so much. And Lawrence, to finish off, we're almost done, but you take the last the minutes remaining to answer the question, especially with Spain coming up. What does that mean? How are you feeling about this? And tell us about, living in Spain and the diversity, and share with us a little bit your feelings.
I mean, I can certainly talk as a gay man, married here in Spain. I'm divorced and remarried to another man. As I like to joke, this is true equality. We get to make the same mistakes heterosexuals make. But both my first marriage and the first years of my second marriage were not acknowledged back in the US. So I could have married a woman because the US didn't acknowledge that I was legally married. So that I remember when marriage equality happened in Spain, instead of just adding it, Spain rewrote their constitution to make marriage a gender neutral institution. It's, I think, the only country that's done this, that instead of adding gay marriage as something extra, they made marriage equality the conjugal union of any two partners. And that, yes, it's a Catholic country, but it became a lay country at that point, I think. And so definitely the support, I am currently translating with support from the program a gay novel for Seagull Books. It's something that it's included. There's not discrimination. As I mentioned, when as a publisher, especially a publisher publishing women poets in translation, not all countries are willing to support their women writers in the same way. I've gotten grants for women's titles as well. That isn't a problem. Just to go back to gender and translation, I mean, one interesting project with a team of Indigenous Canadian creators, Richard Van Camp and Julie Flett. This is a board book that doesn't ever gender the baby being addressed. So it shows different Indigenous families. It's in different combinations, but the you who's being addressed is never gendered. I translated this book into Spanish for, in this case, not for Spain, but for Orca. One of the first things I had to do, little you, all the diminutives in Spanish are gendered. So I changed the title to You Are You. But to me, it was important to create a book that, I had to take many more liberties in the translation to create a book that was rhyming, gender neutral, and thus respected the spirit of the book much more, even though I had to take more liberties. And so, the book has very little text, as you saw in that brief thing. I did a simple translation using the masculine as the neutral, as Spanish canonically does. That wasn't true to the spirit of the inclusivity of the book. And so I then labored to make a rhyming, gender neutral translation as well, which took a few weeks. And that's the one that was finally published. So, I mean, I think even our languages do affect, I mean, I don't know from the Quebecois side, from the French, there's a lot more work to undo a lot of these historic inequalities. So even just on a linguistic level, which, at the same time, having the support made it possible to make these queer voices from Spain, like this book, was much easier for me to find a publisher in the English-speaking world for, thanks to Spain being the guest of honor country, and they were able to apply, to a smaller independent press that otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford to translate work like this if there wasn't this opportunity that we have now, in our year being the guest country. And hopefully the support will continue years later, the way that Canada already does, having this ongoing support for translations of Canadian writers.
Thank you, Lauren, so much for sharing all of that, and Katia as well. This was a delightful conversation. Again, I think we could talk for endless hours here. We barely touched on a lot of, I mean, I think I think we ended up with more questions than answers, which is always a good thing. You know, it's anyway, thank you so much once again to both of you. And I welcome again the viewers to continue to check out the other talks in the series, in the Canada-Spain series. And thank you.